Christophe Rocancourt was born in 1967 in Honfleur, a small port town on the Normandy coast of France. His childhood was brutal. His father was an alcoholic house painter, his mother a teenage prostitute. By the time he was 5 years old, both parents had abandoned him. He spent his formative years shuffled between orphanages and foster homes, growing up with nothing but his wits and an acute understanding of what it meant to be invisible. But Rocancourt had no intention of staying invisible. As a teenager, he discovered something remarkable about himself. He could talk. He could charm. He could make people believe whatever he wanted them to believe. And most importantly, he realized that wealthy people rarely questioned someone who acted like they belonged. By his late teens, Rocancourt had already begun his criminal career in France, committing petty thefts and small-time frauds. But he had bigger ambitions. He studied the mannerisms of the rich. He learned how to dress, how to speak, how to carry himself with the casual confidence of someone born into money. He understood that the key to deception wasn't elaborate schemes or forged documents. It was psychology. It was making people want to believe in you. In 1991, at the age of 24, Rocancourt arrived in the United States. He landed in Los Angeles with almost nothing. Within months, he would be living in a mansion in Bel Air, rubbing shoulders with Hollywood celebrities, and calling himself a Rockefeller. What made Christophe Rocancourt exceptional among con artists was his audacity. He didn't claim to be a moderately successful businessman or a minor European aristocrat. He claimed to be among the wealthiest and most powerful people on earth. Over his career, Rocancourt adopted dozens of identities. He posed as Christopher Rockefeller, heir to one of America's most famous fortunes. He claimed to be a member of the Rothschild banking dynasty. He presented himself as the son of Sophia Loren. He said he was a French boxing champion, a venture capitalist, a film producer, a Formula One driver. Sometimes he combined these identities, creating elaborate backstories that made him seem like the most interesting man anyone had ever met. The key to his success was his complete commitment to whatever role he was playing. He lived these identities. He didn't just tell people he was wealthy. He acted wealthy. He stayed in the finest hotels. He dined at the most exclusive restaurants. He drove luxury cars and wore expensive watches. The fact that he was paying for none of this with his own money was a detail his marks never suspected. Rocancourt understood something fundamental about human nature. People see what they expect to see. A confident man in a tailored suit staying at a 5-star hotel, dropping famous names, must be exactly what he claims to be. Why would anyone lie about being a Rockefeller? The claim itself was so outrageous that it created its own credibility. Los Angeles in the early 1990s was the perfect hunting ground for Rocancourt. The entertainment industry was filled with people desperate for connections, for financing, for access to power, and everyone in Hollywood was already playing a role. Rocancourt inserted himself into the celebrity social scene with remarkable speed. He attended exclusive parties. He secured memberships to elite clubs. He moved through Beverly Hills and Bel Air as if he had lived there his entire life. His marks included some of the biggest names in entertainment. Among those who fell for his schemes was Mickey Rourke, who considered Rocancourt a close friend and was photographed with him numerous times. Jean-Claude Van Damme became an associate. Rocancourt was seen at events with actors, producers, and Hollywood executives who had no idea they were socializing with a French orphan running one of the longest cons in the city's history. He dated models and actresses. He attended premieres and galas. He lived in a mansion in Bel Air that he had obtained through fraud, convincing the owner to let him stay while promising massive investment deals that would never materialize. His primary scheme was straightforward but effective. He would approach wealthy individuals, usually through social connections he had cultivated, and propose investment opportunities. Sometimes it was real estate. Sometimes it was film production. Sometimes it was vague business ventures that he described in terms impressive enough to obscure their complete lack of substance. He would collect money, promising extraordinary returns, and then simply keep it. But what made Rocancourt different from ordinary investment fraudsters was his lifestyle. He wasn't collecting money and hiding it away. He was spending it immediately, visibly, spectacularly. He was living the life of a billionaire heir, and that performance was itself the con. His victims saw their money being spent on the trappings of extreme wealth and assumed their investment must be legitimate. Why would a Rockefeller need to steal? In 1996, Rocancourt's life took an unexpected turn when he met Pia Reyes, a Playboy model from Santa Monica. Their relationship would become one of the most public aspects of his story. Reyes was young, beautiful, and initially had no idea about Rocancourt's criminal activities. She believed she had fallen in love with a French aristocrat connected to the Rockefeller fortune. They had a child together, a son named Zeus. But Reyes would later claim that she too was a victim of Rocancourt's deceptions. As his schemes began to unravel and law enforcement closed in, the relationship deteriorated. She would eventually become a witness against him, providing authorities with information about his fraudulent activities. Their son Zeus became a complicated part of Rocancourt's story, a child born into a relationship built entirely on lies. By the late 1990s, Rocancourt had expanded his operations beyond Los Angeles. He discovered a new hunting ground on the opposite coast, the Hamptons in New York. The Hamptons offered everything Rocancourt needed: extreme wealth concentrated in a small area, social climbers desperate to connect with old money, a summer party scene where introductions happened quickly and backgrounds were rarely verified. Rocancourt arrived in the Hamptons with his usual confidence. He rented expensive properties. He attended charity events. He played polo. He presented himself as a European aristocrat with connections to French nobility and American industrial wealth. And he continued to steal. His victims in the Hamptons ranged from socialites to businessmen. He took money for investments that didn't exist. He wrote bad checks. He ran up bills he had no intention of paying. Estimates of his total fraud over the years ranged from several $100,000 to tens of millions, though the exact figure was difficult to establish because many victims were too embarrassed to report their losses. But Rocancourt's luck was running out. Complaints were accumulating. Law enforcement in multiple jurisdictions had begun comparing notes. And Rocancourt made a critical mistake. He stayed too long in the same place, running the same cons on people who eventually started talking to each other. In 1998, Rocancourt was arrested in the Hamptons on fraud charges. But what should have been the end of his story became merely another chapter. While awaiting trial, Rocancourt jumped bail. He fled to Canada, settling in Whistler, British Columbia, a ski resort town popular with wealthy vacationers. True to form, he immediately resumed his old tricks, presenting himself to the local social scene as a French aristocrat with fabulous wealth. Canadian authorities eventually caught up with him in 2001. He was arrested in Victoria, British Columbia, after a high-speed chase. Police found him carrying false identification documents and evidence of ongoing fraud schemes. The United States immediately requested extradition. Rocancourt fought it. He spent nearly a year in Canadian custody, battling the extradition order through the courts. He gave interviews from jail, maintaining his charm even behind bars, insisting that he was a victim of misunderstanding. In 2003, he was finally extradited to the United States. He faced charges in New York for theft, fraud, smuggling, and perjury. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Rocancourt eventually pleaded guilty to theft, grand larceny, and other charges. In 2003, he was sentenced to 5 years in state prison in New York. At his sentencing, Rocancourt was characteristically unrepentant. He made statements that suggested he viewed his crimes almost as performance art, a demonstration of how easily the wealthy could be fooled by someone with enough confidence. He seemed to regard his victims with something close to contempt, as if they deserved to be swindled for being gullible enough to believe his stories. He served approximately 3.5 years before being released and deported to France in 2007. Upon his return to France, Rocancourt did something that surprised many observers. He wrote a book. Published in 2002, It detailed his exploits with a mixture of confession and braggadocio. He gave interviews to French media, becoming something of a celebrity in his home country. Rather than hiding from his past, Rocancourt embraced it. He positioned himself as a self-made man who had pulled himself out of poverty and orphanhood through sheer force of will. The fact that he had done so through crime seemed almost secondary in his telling. He appeared on French television talk shows. He was profiled in magazines. His story was discussed as a kind of twisted success story, proof that anyone with enough audacity could penetrate the highest levels of society. Rocancourt also ventured into boxing promotion and other business activities, though he largely stayed out of serious legal trouble after his deportation. What made Christophe Rocancourt successful for so long was not any particular criminal genius. He had no elaborate network of forgers creating documents. He didn't hack into bank systems or create complex corporate shells. His methods were, at their core, remarkably simple. He understood desire. His victims wanted to believe in him. They wanted access to wealth and power. They wanted to be close to someone important. Rocancourt gave them what they wanted to see, and they filled in the rest themselves. He also understood shame. Many of his victims never reported their losses. How could a successful businessman admit to being fooled by a French con man claiming to be a Rockefeller? The embarrassment of being swindled was often greater than the financial loss itself. This code of silence among victims allowed Rocancourt to operate for years without facing consequences. And he understood the fundamental truth that separates successful con artists from amateurs. The bigger the lie, the more likely people are to believe it. Claiming to be a minor European businessman would invite scrutiny. Claiming to be a Rockefeller was so absurd that it short-circuited skepticism entirely. Christophe Rocancourt remains one of the most audacious con artists of the late 20th century. His story has been featured in documentaries, magazine articles, and television programs. He became a symbol of a particular kind of fraud, the confidence man who succeeds not through elaborate planning, but through sheer force of personality. His victims learned expensive lessons about the dangers of assumption. The wealthy circles he penetrated were forced to acknowledge their own vulnerabilities, their willingness to accept claims of status without verification, their eagerness to associate with power regardless of evidence. Rocancourt himself never expressed genuine remorse. To him, the con was almost a philosophy. He had been born with nothing, abandoned by everyone, raised in institutions. Society had given him no legitimate path to success. So he created his own path, and if that meant exploiting the gullibility of the rich, so be it. As of recent years, Rocancourt has largely faded from public attention. He lives in France, occasionally surfacing for interviews or media appearances. He is in his late 50s now, no longer the young, charming imposter who fooled Hollywood. But his story endures as a cautionary tale, and for some, a perverse inspiration. A boy from a Normandy orphanage who talked his way into Bel Air mansions and Hamptons estates. A man who proved that identity is, in many ways, simply a matter of conviction. The question his story leaves behind is an uncomfortable one. How many Christophe Rocancourts are out there right now, wearing borrowed identities, spending stolen money, living lives that exist only in the imagination of their victims?